All these complex issues. Our webinar comprises Professor Uma Chakravarti. Uma is a noted filmmaker and historian. She is a scholar of women's and feminist theory in the subcontinent. She's also coined the phrase Brahminical patriarchy, which has proved to be an extremely important framework to understand the social and structural relations between men and women. We also have Dr. Shekhar Seshadri. He's a psychiatrist and professor at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NIMHANS, Bangalore. Dr. Seshadri is known for his work on areas of child sexual abuse, trauma, gender, sexual minorities, and masculinity. Also joining us today is Dr. Carol Ireland. She is the Director of Department of Forensic Psychology at the University of Central Lancashire. And she's also the lead for sex offender assessment at the Coastal Child and Adult Therapeutic Services in the UK. So thank you all for joining this evening. Before we begin, just some general idea about how this will proceed. So for the first hour, we will have a moderated discussion. And the last 30 minutes of the webinar, that is from 6:30 to 7, are saved for questions from the audience. Whoever is watching, please put in your questions in the Q&A icon that you see on your Zoom screen or on the YouTube live chat. Right. So I guess to start off, I'd like opening comments, and Uma has already said she would not want to go first. So maybe from starting with Carol, on how do we understand who the perpetrator of sexual violence is? Is there one kind? Are there many kinds? So how do we understand the perpetrator? Yeah.
Okay, so what I can, obviously from my experience, I work in the UK. I've worked with this population probably over 25 years now. I used to work in the prison service prior to that, and I work in high secure psychiatric services, and I'm now also working in the community as well with that kind of population. And I think certainly in the UK, certainly in terms of kind of sex offender intervention, understanding, we're kind of very theoretically, empirically driven in terms of that. I think we've got a really good understanding actually around perpetrators of sexual abuse towards children, and particularly male offenders. I'm going to just talk specifically about kind of male offenders, really. I think female offenders is a whole different kind of discussion in terms of that. If I think about one of the biggest kind of our kind of seminal models, really, theoretical approaches around understanding child sexual abuse in adult male perpetrators. You've got Marsh and Barber's integrated theory of abuse, and what they kind of talk about is vulnerabilities around offending. So they will argue that actually, with a certain set of circumstances and life experiences, we can present with a range of vulnerabilities that can interact together that put an individual at risk of engaging in that kind of behaviour. And they have a very developmental approach in terms of that. So we look at kind of the history in terms of that kind of individual. So they would talk about very early in terms of kind of insecure attachments, for example, poor parenting, kind of leads to a failure to explore and to take risks as a child, poor emotional kind of management. They then struggle to disclose feelings towards others, which then becomes problematic when they become adolescents and adults, because they find difficulties in disclosing parts of themselves, what you would expect in terms of interpersonal and intimate relationships. They talk about, some exposure to inappropriate role modelling. I think what's really important with this is to kind of not go down the avenue that if an individual has been abused themselves sexually as a child, that does not mean they will become a perpetrator themselves at all. Because most victims of abuse know that it is abuse and know that it is wrong. It's very much about their interpretation around that. Sometimes you may have some individuals that have been so heavily groomed and coerced that they have a belief structure that has not been challenged, where they perhaps believe that actually sexual interaction between children and adults is seen as being okay. It's very distorted, but it's never been contested. But even with that, you would need more than one vulnerability. It just wouldn't be that belief structure on its own. What Marsh and Barber would talk about, certainly within the UK, is this kind of transition from childhood to adulthood, and to puberty in particular, is very critical. When the kind of child reaches puberty, they start to put their sexual scripts together, they start to learn what's okay, what's not okay in terms of appropriate sexual healthy kind of behaviours. They may kind of then have all these kind of poor childhood experiences start to fuse together for them. They then try and gain intimate kind of relationships, as you would expect, particularly around adolescence. They start to test out that kind of interaction, but they don't have the social skills. They haven't learned the behaviours because of the poor experiences prior to that. So they're met a lot with rejection, and their social skills can be quite deficit for them as well. And then what Marsh and Boyd would talk about is that actually they may then start to turn toward younger children, so as adolescents and then adults, they start to turn towards younger children as being viable, because they start to have this distorted view that children are kind of a sexual being, they're somebody to engage with in a sexual way. It is distorted and it is minimised, but that is very much how the model would kind of talk about. You know, it would talk about actually sexual behaviour in terms of sexual offending is not just about sexual gratification. There are lots of other ways by which an individual can get that need met. It meets a lot of other requirements and needs for them. So a sense of closeness, for example, an increase in self-esteem, an increase in masculinity. If they're particularly traditional hyper-masculine, for example, it may start to reinforce that in particular. But then Marshall Boyd would also talk about situational factors as well, which can create the kind of likelihood of offending behaviour taking place, such as the presence of a victim. There can also be catalysts to that behaviour as well. So you may have an individual who has loads of vulnerabilities, but they're less likely to demonstrate and engage in sexual offending unless a certain requirement of kind of variables are in place, such as kind of stress, a crisis for them, you know, finding difficult to cope with things, they're emotionally dysregulated. So it's a combination of factors. And I think certainly from the UK's point of view, in terms of working with this kind of population, we do see kind of sexual offending as kind of very multifactorial. So it's not driven by one factor. I think that's me. I think I had 5 minutes there. I think that's a quick 5 minute summary from myself.
Dr. Seshadri, would you like to go next?
Maitri, before I go on next, may I point out that some inappropriate comments are being posted on the Q&A. I would urge the hosts to ensure that this kind of objectionable comments not be put on Q&A.
Yeah.
They are outrageous and they are insulting to a very serious discussion that we are having. They are abusive and this is completely unacceptable. So,
absolutely. I'm just going to try and disable the Q&A for now. If you could give me just 1 minute so that I can just take care of this. Thank you.
I want to take off from a point that Dr. Carol Ireland made and link this to a question that Pinky Virani had put to me when she was writing her book, Bitter Chocolate, you know, who are perpetrators? This was many years ago when the culture of denial and the conspiracy of silence was prevailing in India. And this was the time that many of us wanted to work in the area of child sexual abuse because we were aware of so many cases that came to us, but there was a lot of resistance in doing personal safety workshops in schools because people said this is a Western phenomena, it doesn't exist in India, and where is the evidence in any case? And it was at that point of time that Pinky wrote the book Bitter Chocolate, and the question she put me was this question of who perpetrators are. And I said the prevailing beliefs are precisely one of the issues that Carol mentioned. You know, are perpetrators those who have themselves been abused as children? And the truth is, not all children who have been abused necessarily turn out to be adult perpetrators, and not adults who perpetrated have necessarily been abused as children. So that's not an invariable association. It's only one possible pathway of potential vulnerability. The other prevailing belief was that these are people who have mental illness. and serious forms of mental illness. Now, that also is not true. To believe that child sexual abuse is perpetrated, let's say, by men who have serious mental illness uh, is, is insulting even to mental illness, because a lot of mentally ill people are very compassionate, and they don't engage in this kind of behavior. The third notion was that they have a condition called pedophilia. Now, not all people who abuse children are necessarily pedophiles, and not all pedophiles necessarily abuse children. They
Yeah.
love children so much that they may not even touch them. Right? And the
Mm.
fourth prevailing notion, and a plausible notion at that point of time, was the misinformation that prevailed, particularly for men, that the treatment for sexual incapacity or impotence or sexually transmitted disease was to have sex with young children, and this was quite problematic. Um, and this was in a scenario where a lot of sexuality related problems in people were relegated to the by lanes and back alleys of cities, and not in mainstream health facilities. And so this is one part of the story. The second issue, as far as perpetration is concerned, building on another theory, is that these are people who have a need, whatever its origins may be, however legitimate or otherwise, biological, social. That need is not met with in legitimate, socially sanctioned adult relationships. These are people who have access to children. And if you look at the profile of particularly perpetrators of child sexual abuse, these are people who have access to children. And as we know, upwards of 90% of people who abuse children are known to children. And they have no internal control and they have no external control. And that's the kind of justification. After all, I'm not hurting the child, and Carol alluded to this. The next thing I want to say is that child sexual abuse is a childhood and children's issue. It is a sex and sexuality issue. It's an abuse, exploitation, violence issue. It's a gender and patriarchy issue, and it's a power and domination issue. In a given case, the one more than the other. Let's look at not so much child sexual abuse, but perpetration, particularly violent perpetration. And if you examine historically, let's say the Bhavari Devi case, Bhavari Devi was a Sathan in Rajasthan who opposed child marriage during Akha Tej, and she was gang raped by. Now, the rape of Bhavari Devi, while sexual in nature, was more a power and dominate. Sexuality was used as a method of subjugation, and this has been a problem historically, because when countries go to war or communities go to war, the ultimate sign of subjugation is that you pillage the city, you kill the men, and you rape the women. And so this notion, therefore, problematic notion of honor, and the patriarchal notion that honor resides in one part of the female anatomy, is hugely problematic, because there is no scientific or historical basis to this. This is clearly a construction of patriarchy, to control the, and also the construction of man as both the protector and the predator is an ingenious construction of patriarchy to control women. And which is why we often say that virtue is an internal state, virginity is a choice, vagina is an anatomical structure. Don't confuse the three. And that's why in our therapeutic work, we often um, provide the counterpoint to this pernicious internalization that many people have about honor. And so this is a framework that we need to keep in mind about the whole notion of perpetration. The last arm of the framework, of course, is the whole issue on masculinity, and the whole premise of both entitlement on the one hand, and it's unfortunate that masculinity is not constructed as a spontaneous thing that unfolds over. It's a precarious thing that you have to achieve at all odds, particularly where the sexual dynamics between the genders are concerned, and the whole entitlement acquisition paradigm, in order to prove that this is also a hugely problematic paradigm, and this is what boys internalize growing up. So the conscientization, to borrow a phrase from Paulo Freire, one might even argue there's no hope for men, but there's hope for boys, and that's where we'd like to focus, our energies to really create a truly egalitarian society, which doesn't function under the pernicious triangulation of patriarchy, homophobia, and heterosexism on the one hand, and patriarchy, gynophobia, and misogyny on the other hand. So these are some of, and of course, there is the whole theory on the roots of violence itself. Remove from the whole gender sexuality paradigm violence itself as a means of conflict resolution, both in terms of interpersonal conflict, community-based conflicts, or gendered conflicts. That and there's a whole historical root which I hope that Dr. Uma Chakravarti, with her scholarship on history, will allude to some aspects of this, particularly from the experience of women's issues. So this is a basic framework that I wanted to share about perpetration, and going ahead, we will expand on some of these nuances a little more in detail. Over to you, Maitri.
Well, I'm so glad that I insisted that Carol and Shekhar open, because at least I have some leads that I can now take up on. I was going to deal specifically. I wasn't going to look at the child as the victim / survivor of sexual violence, particularly, but I will come to that in a minute. I take my cue from the question of dominance and power. And in that context, I think one of the problems that we are faced with as feminists and as the women's movement is to actually acknowledge the huge blur in the question of entitlement to women's bodies, particularly if it is a case of dominance in multiple ways. For instance, power in the rural areas, which is highly skewed, both on caste and class lines, is exacerbated by the kind of patriarchy that one has, and masculinity is and very regionally sort of it works also, because the idea that men naturally have access to women's bodies, regardless of, I would say, for instance, if marital rape was made an issue, it seems to me that there would be some way in which you would also have a fallout from, in terms of thinking about what privileges does the population of men, heterosexist men in particular, and those in dominant positions have over their notion of their rights to the bodies of vulnerable sections. Now, I think that apart from questions of class, we have deep-rooted caste lines, which actually make for very, the entitlement is much more endemic in those cases, because the bottommost sections of society, the Dalits and lower castes, are not seen as having rights at all, having even being regarded as people in any sense of the term. So in a sense, the idea that you need to respect the bodies of everyone, question of sexual autonomy is something that we've had to struggle so desperately to put on the page for people to acknowledge. It's a situation which one has had to battle, because actually the person you have sexual access to is never been say a category that's highlighted as far as the structure of social relations is concerned. So caste class, exacerbated by gender and patriarchal norms, very toxic masculinity in certain regions, has actually made for us a highly skewed notion of entitlement and privilege. And in that context, I will just say, for instance, this combination is deadly. Shekhar has already mentioned the case of Satin, which is the Bhamri, which is interesting because actually what she was trying to do was to say children have a right to, all children have a right to actually grow into adults and then be taken into their marriage and sexual existence. But that, because it violated custom as it was perpetrated, as it had come down, was seen as threatening the power of those who decide these issues. And who decides this issue is a kind of, it's part of culture, it's part of, it's very masculine and very, in which of course women may be implicated. So all of this has meant that actually the idea of the child, and I would like to ask Shekhar to extend this, the idea of the girl child in particular as a bearer of rights to her own body is actually not something that we have historically seen. I'll alert you to say, for instance, the debates around the age of marriage. Historically, there are huge debates between the colonial state and Indian reformers on the one hand, and others on when should a girl be considered fit for sexual use. And that was a debate that was huge. So when the age was shifted from 10 to 12, it became a huge controversy because it was seen as marking an assault on the Hindu marriage system itself. And this meant, and at the center of this is really, who is the child? What is a child? At what age does a person stop being a child? When does she, when can she be seen as someone who has a certain degree of, let's not put it as rights, as someone who is not in the kind of vulnerable power situation that she is otherwise when you have sexual abuse perpetrated on her or rape perpetrated on her. So this is actually quite a complex set of questions that we have. And I would just, so caste, class, patriarchy working together in certain areas has meant that there's a natural naturalness in the way in which you consider the girl child or the young person or even the older person as someone you who cannot be the bearer of rights and who you have the toxic masculinity feels that it has a right to. And there's this case, I will just stop at that. There was this case of a young woman, a young Dalit girl, who went across to her landlord's house to look after the child in the master's house, and where this was in South India, where the master misbehaved with her. When she came back and she reported this to her mother, the mother went and protested, and then the girl was beheaded. Now, that's the kind of combination of social power that I'm talking about, which actually makes it very difficult to break the question of child and slightly older person, and because all of them are vulnerable and they are regarded as non-bearers of rights to themselves. So I would just take it to that point at the moment.
So if I could just take this conversation a little bit forward, we've in your opening remarks, we have spoken of issues of who the perpetrator is, also in a certain way who the victim survivor is. We've also spoken of different kinds of sexual violence that is perpetrated. But there is also this question of there is sexual violence and then there is sexual offense. And not all types of sexual violence is considered an offense. So I would just like to also, for a very, very brief moment, because I would also want to go on to questions of accountability, but maybe Carol and Dr. Seshadri, you could come in here, but starting with Uma, in the Justice Verma committee process and the discussions there were quite a few discussions on what kind of sexual violence can be called sexual offense, including who the victim and the perpetrator might also be. But could you just give us maybe for 2 minutes an insight into those kinds of discussions?
Yeah, I think that's good point, because I see the Justice Verma Committee moment as actually a very critical moment from the point of view of all the work that the women's movement had done for something like 30 years, coming together in possibly a moment of change in which not only one would think about the offense as defining offenses itself, or looking at the range of offenses that could be put under the violation of bodily autonomy, but also the very serious questions around how shall we look at, say, for instance, the young perpetrator of sexual violence, even if it's actually sexual violence, not lesser than that, came up. And I need to point out that one of the things about the women's movement, despite the fact that we've had to deal with such a huge range of examples of sexual violence upon vulnerable sections of our population, that the question of the understanding of a moral understanding of young people is actually very vulnerable and under certain ages. And so child workers, people who had worked with children and so on, were very insistent that the perpetrator cannot be held legally responsible till they are regarded as someone who have, as people who have actually been able to understand questions of moral behavior or moral actions. And we were all, I mean, the entire women's movement, which was there at the Justice Verma Committee, took this up and we're all on the same page. So as far as, the child who is the subject of a sexual violence, or even flipping it the other side, the assaulter who is young, has a certain place in our understanding and conceptualization. And I do want to say here that the women's movement has never been, it may be seen as something which is seeking retributive justice, but not. Really, we are actually very strongly on the path to seeking a transformation in society in which women should be regarded as people who are entitled to their own sexual autonomy. And that's actually the critical thing, whether it's child, whether it's slightly younger, or whether it's slightly older, or even in marriage.
Yeah, Carol, could you, in adding to this, could you also talk about maybe a little bit about behaviors which within the psychiatric community have been labeled as disorders? And so you have disorders, and then you have violence, and then you have offense. So yeah.
Well, what I can talk about in terms of kind of in the UK is that we don't really diagnose sexual offending. I think there's a reference maybe for paedophilia, for example, and there may, within psychiatry, maybe may have some individual may kind of have that as a diagnosis, but it's not something you really kind of follow, because it's more about the behaviours and the motivations and the functions of that behaviour. We don't see sexual offending necessarily as being a mental disorder. It's kind of, we're more interested in the behaviours themselves that are being shown. And I think to pick up on an earlier point that you mentioned before about kind of when is sexual violence not a sexual offence. I think certainly in the UK, I think we'd struggle with that because sexual violence is violence, you know, so anything that's seen as meeting a threshold for criminal responsibility, we would see as being inappropriate. And certainly around sexual offending, the definition is quite broad actually. And sexual offending is seen as an aggressive act. And if we think about even in empirically and in the literature, you know, it's defined as aggressive, irrespective as to whether the actual perpetrator believes that to be the case. You know, and again, I've worked with clients that have kind of engaged in sexual offences against children, but because it's so distorted for them, they've seen it as this kind of loving kind of relationship in their misperception and misconstruction around that, but it's nonetheless still regarded as an aggressive act. And we've got quite a broad range in terms of that, because sexual offending could include threats of sexual harm towards somebody. It could include physical, which can be from obviously indecent assault to rape. It can include exposure offences as well, and you've also got downloading child abuse imagery as well. So it's actually a very broad remit in terms of how we kind of define sexual offending. And again, I know we're speaking obviously more about kind of male perpetration in terms of this today, but it obviously is much more far-reaching in terms of that as well. So our definition is probably quite broad in the UK. It's also about criminal responsibility as well. So in the UK, for example, you know, our criminal responsibility is over the age of 10. But of course, children are treated very differently, as you would expect, in the kind of that system as opposed to adults.
Dr. Seshadri?
Yeah, I want to sort of cap this part of the discussion by referring to certain behaviors and trends in civil society, as it were. The dividing line between sexual misbehavior, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and sexual violence are not all that sharply defined. And somewhere, I think the response of, let's say, families and parents and even the system, such as the police and the judiciary, where you uphold certain institutions over others, after all, he only touched you, he didn't, or after all, he just tore your clothes and it wasn't rape, or, or thank God you're not pregnant, or, thank God you're not HIV positive, as though that. And we must understand that the impact of any kind of sexual boundary violation does not necessarily depend on the violence of the act. And I'll tell you why. You may have a child, boy or girl, who is assaulted by a stranger, clothes are torn, the body is handled. That child may heal faster because of good family response and therapeutic assistance, and this perpetrator is caught because he's been assaulting other children. But a kid whose uncle keeps on making sexual invitations but doesn't even touch her may be affected more psychologically then. So we need to understand where adult perpetration of child sexual abuse is concerned. And, and we are not going into the complexities of boy children and women perpetrators or of adult women's sexual assault, because there are all these contexts, and they are important to keep in mind. That is, between contact and non-contact, and I relate this to the 2012 law, the Prevention of Sexual Offences Against Children Act, and the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. And the between contact and non-contact, and in contact between genital and non-genital, and genital between penetrative and non-penetrative, and the quantum of the punishment which the law ensures, needs to be kept in mind, as we go along, and the relative impact that it has on people who experience this abuse slash violence. So this is another framework that we need to keep in mind about the manner in which legitimization of certain forms of behavior or misbehavior actually takes place. And interestingly, there's actually a question that Nandini Goel has put to Uma, and she said it's an old question, but I'm going to repeat it and set the foundation for my following question. In a country like India, where movies present women clad in sari and praying and as good characters, and girls wearing short skirts and tank top are shown as being provocative and victims of rape, in a society where a large number of people have this notion rooted in their minds, how do you think Bollywood movies impact on the minds of people? And interestingly, the whole debate after Nirbhaya on protection of women, to me, is a perverse debate because it's an incomplete debate. I'm not saying protection of women is not important. Of course it is. And we are all concerned with it. But it's an incomplete debate because the debate should equally be on the freedom of women. It's not just about protection. A woman should be free to wear whatever the heck she wants and be out at whatever time she wishes, and nobody has the right to touch her. There was, interestingly, a Facebook post at that time of a woman who's nude from her torso upwards with a cigarette in her hand and a caption that says,
I think Dr. Seshadri has dropped out. He is having some internet connection, I think.
no, I've got back.
Oh, you're back. Okay, great.
Yeah. I'm sorry. It says still not asking for it.
Right. So can I
just to complete, because he raised that, well, one of the things that flooded the scene of demonstrations after the Nirbhaya case was actually these big slogans which focused. One was very important, which is "Don't tell me what to wear. Teach your son not to rape." So actually, the focus was being put strongly in the direction of the men to create another kind of society, which is like So in a sense that for years and years, this question of who is the who's the prototype of the raped woman is if you break it down, it's like from the 2-month-old child all the way till the 80-year-old woman. And it has nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with what people wear or what they are, the kind of thing that they are supposed to be generating. So in a sense, that's the kind of counter narrative that has to be put out. Now, in all of this stuff, when you're confronting society with violence, there's a retreat and there's a way in which forces will come together to try and trivialize the issue by breaking it down and putting the onus on the woman. And I think one of the things that we did break in 2012 was this situation, because now I think less and less that kind of an argument is made.
Right. So I was also interested in exploring questions of accountability in a way. So we've spoken about very passingly questions of healing, and we'll come to that in a bit. But we've also spoken about, Uma, when you say that the discourse was teach your son not to rape. It's obviously coming from a place of like we've discussed, power and patriarchy, and saying I have the right over a woman's body. Carol, I was just wondering if in your experience with treatment, have these issues come up of where the in a way the distortion in thought is that I own a woman's body, and how do we then treat assertion of power like that? Because as of now we have penal we have incarceration and it ends at that, but this is obviously a mindset. And so in talking about accountability, what are the different kinds of responses that the state could adopt potentially in your experience, apart from or in addition to incarceration? So yeah.
Well, obviously in the UK, we do a lot of stuff around intervention. I think that we've, for many years now, we've appreciated that kind of, just incarceration on its own isn't effective, and in some instances can make it worse for individuals as well. So certainly in the UK, they've invested a lot in intervention approaches, and we're quite varied in terms of that. I think what I'm listening to in terms of entitlements in particular, so we would address that in terms of intervention, and to give an idea around the kind of the rehabilitation that we tend to do. I mean, some of the standard packages, for example, intervention and therapeutic approaches, just for the initial issues around sexual offending, maybe around 100 sessions, usually group therapy, which can work quite well, because then you can have individuals who can actually ask questions of each other within that group that have different views. They can be really good into the challenging ideas around entitlement, for example. So we would explore what that entitlement is. And you have a lot of that around sexual offending as well. Sexual entitlement, general entitlement about I want what I want, it's mine, I will take what I want. We then try and understand where that has come from for that individual, really. And there can be lots of different sources in terms of that. And then in terms of therapy, we would try and break that down. So for example, if it's driven by a belief system that I'm entitled to have what I want, then we would explore that with them. We would explore why they have that belief, where that belief came from. We would then start to break that belief down, challenge that belief. Oh, I've got an echo there. I hear myself coming back. But yes, I think for me, it's just another extension around the various distortions and minimizations which you get in terms of kind of working with this population, and certainly around the kind of the intervention. I'd probably say the first third of our intervention approach is very much about trying to break down that distorted, minimizing, entitlement kind of thinking. So yes, it's a long-term process. I think we have our sessions, maybe about 100 sessions, for example, but then often there's additional therapy that may come after that, because often you're trying to change schemas, you're trying to change their view of the world as well, and that is a very slow process.
But does that somewhere take away from criminal responsibility and accountability?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And a perpetrator of sexual violence is always responsible for their behaviours, and I think the only exception to that may be if they're sectioned under the Mental Health Act, because they're seen as not being responsible. But having worked in high secure psychiatric services as well, I see that happening very rarely, actually, because even individuals who've got mental disorder, often the sexual offending is not linked in with mental disorder at all. It's something quite separate in terms of that. So offenders ultimately are always responsible. They're adults at the end of the day, so they're responsible for their behaviours, and we have to acknowledge that.
Right. So Uma, one of the things that I had been thinking about, and maybe you can sort of discuss this further, but I was also thinking that, is it in looking at sexual violence, and here I'm talking about only male assertion of power, I'm not talking about, and the victim could be, of course, very transgender women, but the male asserting power. There's been a lot of calls for, of course, harsher punishments, but there's also this thing of chemical castration. And both approaches seem rather retributive and harsh. And I was wondering what the discourse in the feminist circles is within the feminist movement about how do we ensure accountability, individual accountability. There's obviously social accountability as well to be had, but individual accountability, but not resorting to popular punitivism.
Yeah, well, let me break that into two parts. One is, I suggested already that that actually the women's movement's interest in retributive accountability, retributive punishment for people, I mean, stuff like this, castration and the death penalty and so on. All of this is something that the women's movement has very forcefully thrown aside. That is not actually where the focus should be. And to that extent, I think the rehabilitative or the modes by which you could, create self-awareness post the incarceration is something that we would all be, we would all want to join that, we would all want to support that in whatever way. Because we're not seeing this as something that's coming as a thing that cannot be reversed, cannot be actually transformed. Now, from that point of view, I think that there is a larger question of impunity and accountability, which to me is very fundamental. I think if we do not have accountability in critical areas of our functioning, for instance, if we do not have accountability in the border areas, because under military and under security apparatus, it is impossible to actually get even justice. So you cannot even proceed again. So there is a kind of common law impunity that has been put into place in certain sectors. So subject populations, volatile populations that are seeking, change in some form or the other. There is a kind of, it's almost like sanctioned that such things can be actually done as part of the teaching them a lesson kind of thing. Now, that does not stop there, because how do you actually fold it? It has consequences all the way down to including, say, for instance, questions of autonomy within marriage. So if the wife has no rights to say no, and it's not acknowledged, then how is a society going to actually say how do you actually say that you cannot take your pleasure based on somebody else? You have to find. So in that sense of the term, I think ultimately rehabilitative justice can only come when you can create an atmosphere in which you do not concede that impunity to all men, but particularly certain categories of men. And I do remember at the heart of that debate we were having when post Justice Verma, it was one of the generals who actually was very strong on the fact that you must not bring in marital rape into this phenomenon. So it was almost like the sacred borders have to be maintained and all power must be given to the security apparatus, and the home has to be maintained as a space which is inviolate. That will automatically have its consequences on children also. It is not going to be something, if the house, the home is the man is the master of the house and men are the masters of the house, then that creates a certain kind of automatic impunity, which is actually what we would like to challenge. But in doing so, I would want the focus to be put first on the woman, the survivor. We have no rehabilitative mechanism for them. We have no counseling. We have nothing, absolutely nothing in place. So, in a sense, for me, the most important thing is, what am I going to do with this young woman, who is a young or older woman who has been traumatized by the violation, whether it's in a riot or whatever it is. So to me, that's very important. When will we be able to bring that in? So I would want our psychologists and psychiatrists to actually work on that. To me, that's very important.
Right. So, I mean, Dr. Seshadri, I will come to you in just a minute. Also, because I think some of the questions, just taking off from what Uma just said about survivors of violence, often the discourse in India has been putting victim survivors and accused persons or the perpetrators at polar opposites. So it's almost as if you give to the accused, you take away from the victim survivor. What should effective state responses to both the accused as well as the victim look like? Because I don't think tackling sexual violence through this lens of of give and take, that you give the accused, you take from the victim. I don't think that's effective. But I also wonder if there are parallel responses which are required, rather than this tug of war that we come to. Dr. Seshadri, if you could start that discussion to answer this question. And Carol, to answer this question, if you could also speak a little bit about different treatment options that currently exist. And as I said, in addition to, or alternatives to incarceration.
Actually, let me framework this, taking some points from what both Uma and Carol have said. A very short note on the whole issue of masculinity. Just a disclaimer and a clarification. This session is not about male bashing, so please don't misunderstand that. But Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel, who work a lot in the area of masculinity, particularly this whole entitlement issue. Interestingly, in a TED talk, he said that there were a group of people and they were speaking about this whole reverse gender problem. And this man got up and he made a statement, which is that a black woman took my job. And Michael says that I have a problem with one word in that sentence, a black woman took my job. And the word is the word my. How did you have the belief that it was your job to be taken? Why not a black woman took the job or a black woman took a job? So entitlement, and in fact, he says that masculinity is not so much about the experience of absolute power, because while in patriarchal societies, the power differential between men and women, but there is a power differential between men and other men based on issues of caste and socioeconomic status and so on. So masculinity is not so much about the experience of absolute power. It's more about the experience of entitlement to power and how socialization takes place. So this is one issue. The other is to link it to the point that Uma was making, and this is not just about sexual violence and perpetration. It's about violence in general and gender-based violence and domestic violence. And let's look at biology and men's biology and men's sense of entitlement. The marital thing, and you get married and you expect that you are entitled to it. And then when violence takes place, the question that is of see the framing of the question itself is, what did she do to invite? It's not about what did he do, that what did she do to. And also the whole notion that this is an individual matter and this is a private matter. That's a sanitized version of domestic violence. Is not a private issue. It's a public health issue. It is your issue. It is our issue. It's everybody's issue, and we have to bother ourselves with it. And hence the Bell Bajao campaign. And so I think sexual violence is very deeply embedded in domestic violence, in violence against women, gender-based violence, corporal punishment in schools. So there is a whole power dynamic here, which we need to question, re-question all the time till we create a society which is truly, egalitarian, where conflicts are resolved in ways other than violence. The third point that I wanted to make, and I wanted to relate this to something that has come a lot in the Q&A, which is piling up. I have taken the liberty to answer many of them, and I hope they are satisfied with some of my responses. I've also taken the liberty to put on chat some of our resources which address a lot of these questions. If you go to the section on training, and the section in under training for judiciary, that all our material on children in conflict with the law, particularly after, I'm presuming Carol is familiar with the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015 of India, which happened after the Nirbhaya case, where, but the whole issue of consenting relationships between two 17-year-olds, and so people ask about how, is POCSO deficient? Yes, POCSO is a very new act. It's hardly 8 years old, and it's a work in progress. And I believe that a lot of amendments will take place going ahead. But it's a good act. Its implementation has problems. But to criminalize consenting adolescent relationships, I mean, if you were to criminalize adolescents engaging in consenting relationship, the institutions in India will not have place to keep the millions of kids who engage in. We need to have a more savvy and a more enlightened and emancipated approach.
Can I just put in one quick question here as well? We've spoken about violence at home, with violence against children, domestic violence, state violence in a way. But if you look at media, the most popular kind of, well, I say popular, but the most mainstream kind of sexual violence that gets reported seems to be stranger rape. That is, it's rape, it's violent rape, and it's by this determinate but unknown entity who is a male. That's all we really know about them. But so, would we have different responses to violence at home, violence against children, and these kinds of stranger rape cases? Or do we get so taken in by stranger rape that that's the only one we recognize? But even if that's the only one we recognize, what are the effective responses to that? What could the effective state response be to that? Focusing only on the question that let's only look at stranger rape cases. And in that sense, how do we tackle sexual violence and perpetrators of sexual violence? Yeah.
Well, I would like to address this, drawing from a point that Uma made, which is it's a very powerful point. It addresses the issue you're raising, Maitri, in an indirect way. It's not a direct response. The fundamental approach, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is civil society, or whether it's mental health and well-being, is to constantly question the nature of institutions, particularly the nature of formal institutions within which these experiences take place. Let's take the issue of domestic violence, and in a marital situation, and if a woman were to complain to a women's police station, and they believe that they are being therapeutic when they say, why do you want to, break up the family? And this is what Uma said when she used the word inviolate. If you look at marriage as a metaphor of society, and society as a metaphor of the country, this is hugely problematic, because if the moment you consider marriage as an inviolate institution, then your quote well-meaning unquote advice would be to say, why are you breaking up this family? Yeah, sure, there's a problem, but why don't you try to figure out if this can be sorted out? And therefore you believe that a woman has to continue in an abusive relationship because you think that marriage is an inviolate structure and a metaphor of the neighborhood and as a metaphor of society. So I think that the nature of institutions need to be questioned and redefined and reframed from the perspective of each individual subjectivities and what works for that individual. It's only when you do that you're really being fair and just. Otherwise, everything becomes a sanitized version of.
Right.
So that's the way that I would look at.
Right.
Yeah.
Carol?
Okay, so what was the question again? Because I've got two questions in my head. I've got about stranger rape. Do we kind of treat that differently?
Yeah.
And then something around treatment, perhaps around survivors. Is that kind of? So
what we would treatment say, for perpetrators as well as survivors. Yeah.
As well as survivors. That's a huge range of questions with that one. So looking at the kind of stranger offenders specifically, and again, I think we again some of my experiences within the UK and also with other kind of populations like in Australia and in Canada and the US, for example. I think stranger rape is more likely, obviously, to be to hit the media, to be reported, where the criminal justice system is likely to be involved. I think from that there can be a view that somehow that can be more prevalent, when actually we would strongly argue, certainly in the UK, that actually what is more likely to be prevalent is that the victims of sexual abuse are more likely to be sexually abused by members of their family or acquaintances or people that they know. And it can be very hidden as well, particularly in families. And again, thinking about the victims can be girls and they can be boys as well, you know, because sometimes around a little bit around that, to kind of slightly off track with that, sometimes there can be a view that if a male perpetrator offends against a male child, then that must be their sexual preference in terms of preferring men, for example, when actually that's just not true at all. But it sometimes gets discussed in terms of that. If we're going to think about treatment, kind of shift a little bit away from that towards treatment of victims. So I work a lot with victims of sexual abuse in terms of my clinical kind of practice. I work with victims and offenders, but also not losing sight that offenders can also be victims as well. It's not clear cut in terms of that. You know, we would tend to follow the kind of empirically driven therapies that are shown to be very successful. So, for example, EMDR is a really well-known therapy that we do in the UK, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. It's a shorter therapy, which is why it's got so much value from working with survivors. So it's not kind of saying to the survivor, you know, come and sit and do psychotherapy for 12 months and 2 years and we'll try and repair that for you. It's a lot quicker. So, I mean, I'm thinking about clients that I work with at the moment. I've got a client at the moment who's got a history of sexual abuse perpetrated by a father. We are about 10 sessions in. We've probably got another 5 sessions, about 15 sessions in terms of that kind of trauma and managing that kind of trauma. Because what EMDR would talk about is that trauma was so overwhelming, for example, at the time, that it wasn't able to get processed. It got blocked. It's so traumatic that the brain couldn't process it. So what EMDR does is it mimics that kind of processing that should have happened at the time. For that individuals, it's not a talking therapy as such. You know, those that may or may not be familiar with it, they have like a light bar that the client can look at from left to right, you know, or they may kind of hold tappers that vibrate whilst they're noticing the kind of trauma. We do a lot of EMDR online as well. So I have clients in Australia, for example, and we do it online. You would get the client to tap like this when they're kind of processing, and what you would do is you get them to identify a cluster of those kind of abuse memories, and you would work with like the earliest, the most distressing and the most recent. You would take one of those memories to begin with. You would identify the worst part of that kind of memory. You would then identify a negative belief that they have about themselves when they notice that memory, and you put the two together. And then when they process it, you get them to notice the memory and you get them to kind of repeat in their mind that negative cognition. And as they process, as a therapist, you step in at various points and ask them, what do they notice? And that could be anything, a thought, a feeling, a sensation, another memory may kind of pop into their head. And we don't have a big dialogue about it. We literally would say to them, okay, they might say, I've got a knot in my stomach. And as a therapist, you'd say, okay, go with that. And they carry on tapping when they kind of do that. And that's really that kind of process around the kind of victim therapy. There's CBT for trauma as well, which you can do in terms of that. A little bit around offender rehabilitation. Again, it's very detailed in terms of that.
Is chemical castration, for instance, which is something really spoken about here, an effective treatment in that sense?
No.
Or what would the other options look like?
No, we did it 30 years ago. We were very hot on the job of chemical castration. And then we realised that actually the issues around sexual offending isn't necessarily physically driven. You know, if you think about an individual who's meeting a lot of needs by engaging sexual offending, they're trying to meet a lot of needs. So it may be things like increased self-worth, increased self-esteem. They may be kind of want to feel powerful. I want to feel in control. I want to feel an interpersonal closeness. If you chemically castrate, then you don't remove that need. That need is still there, you know. So we actually, you kind of cause more of a difficulty for that kind of individual. So we certainly don't routinely chemically castrate anymore. We more kind of use kind of psychological intervention to try and unpick what that is for that individual. So for example, if you kind of took Tony Ward's view around the good lives approach around offending rehabilitation, you know, what we would kind of talk about is actually, so rather than the individual kind of engaging in abusive, sexually harmful behaviour to feel good about themselves and to feel a sense of control, what we need to do is think about how they can feel good about themselves and a sense of control in a more healthy, more appropriate way. And if we start to do that, we start to pull them off the offence pathway. That's a very simplistic way of seeing it, because individuals have lots of needs that they kind of engage in. So sex offender therapy is very kind of integrated, it's very kind of long term. And actually, I've kind of used that term loosely there, sex offender therapy. It's not really a phrase that we'd use anymore, because actually we don't want to label people as being sexual offenders. We want to label the behaviour rather than the individual. You know, so for example, in one of the therapies that we use in the UK is like life, manners, violence, harmful sexual behaviour intervention. So it's not what we used to call it, which was the sex offender treatment group, which kind of felt a little bit out of kilter, because we'd kind of say to people, come and join the sex offender treatment group and we'll pull you off your offending. But then we were labelled them in terms of that. So it was very counter-intuitive.
Right.
Could go on. I'll stop.
we have 5 minutes over with eaten into the audience question time, but I would some maybe for now closing comments from the panelists. Uma, if you could start. I know you didn't want to, but yeah. In terms of it's a complicated question, but where do we start the healing process for both the accused, who also through this conversation has come out, has gone through certain experiences and certain factors which have perhaps distorted their own perception of power, and in that themselves disempowering them in a certain sense. But what does this healing process look like? What should it look like, rather?
See, again, I'm back to the problem of the, if you treat the individual as the offender, as someone who is sort of placed in a situation where it is a individual against another individual, then I think the difficulty is in how do we actually, then we are, you know, sort of saying, okay, this person is has been flawed in some way of his own. I mean, there's something about his psychological processes, and then there is this survivor who unfortunately in the Indian context is never even regarded as someone who is worthy of rehab, actual psychological and physical rehabilitation. So I think the problem there is of another kind, because much of what I'm saying and to go back to the stranger rape question, one thing is true, that the stranger rape is the one that is more visibilized, because that's the one that actually gets reported, and that's the one that the newspapers also pick up. So you're not going to tell the story of the uncle who's been abusing a niece or a nephew. So in that sense, I think the manner in which we think about abuse and therefore rehabilitation is skewed in terms of the focus is on this strange character. But that strange character to me is not a strange character, because that strange character is actually embedded in relations of power. And so for me, how do you do that? So at the end of the day, it is clear that even in the conversation, we are putting the emphasis on the man who has, the man or the, including even the woman in the odd case that we are thinking about, rather than the person who has experienced that violence. So to me, I think the whole question is we are very far away from actually thinking about a rehabilitative process. Because for me, the rehabilitative process must first rehabilitate the two parties in a more on a less unequal social platform. And that is the real challenge as far as I'm concerned. So how do we do that? And I think psychiatrists and psychologists and so on need to tell us how we can convince feminists how we can proceed with that, because we are not against the fact that, okay, these people might themselves be requiring healing, but is that going to be my top priority? My top priority is for the survivor of the violence.
Right.
other sections, I often say this, even the reform of men has to form on women. I mean, the women's movement has to lead that. I mean, that's a bit unfair, to say the least. So I want to leave you with that.
Yeah. Dr. Seshadri?
Yeah, very briefly, Maitri, there are actually a lot of questions on chat, and one of my suggestions is actually to retain these questions so that we can meaningfully respond to them, perhaps through some other medium, or perhaps have a follow-up session where we don't present, but we take these questions and work around them. That would be fantastic. It doesn't matter whether you're 16 or whether you're 36 or whether you're 64. The parameters of sexual decision making and healthy relationships, and why perpetration takes place, and why people violate, exploit, uh, engage in boundary violations, and what is the psyche of a violent offender versus an offender who engages in eve teasing, and is in a range of behaviors. Are there some commonalities? And one of the kind of work that we are engaging in when we work within the sector of restorative justice, particularly with the children in conflict with the law, children who are accused of sexual offenses, using some principles of restorative, reformative, and rehabilitative justice versus retributive justice, is to really, other than the techniques of cognitive behavior therapy, and is really a conscientization that takes place through, for lack of a better word, through constructive. May I dare use the word confrontation. Now, by confrontation, I don't mean confrontation in an adversarial sense. I mean, you confront ideas. So you look at the context of sexuality in relationships. What is your sexuality ideology? In adulthood, in a socially, in a relationship legitimized by social sanctions, VIZ marriage, in the context of a relationship with a person who I know for very long, who I'm committed to, who I love deeply, may not necessarily be married. Someone I know well, I've known other people well, I've related to them. Um, I may not last in this relationship, but there is love, commitment, respect, and so on. I don't mind, one night stand, but this is someone I know, and there is chemistry and all that. Or is it blindfold me? I don't care. So, how do people develop their sexuality ideologies, which is the basis of your so there's a relationship ideology. Then there is health and safety. So there's a whole discussion on personal health, other people's health, the issue of safety, the parameters of safety. Then there is privacy and boundaries. Then there is consent and permission, and the issue of consent also came in the chat, in the Q&A earlier. So that's the kind of uh, confrontation of ideas, or discussion and dialogue on ideas, which really um, shifts both for the victim and the perpetrator, the focus on very symptom related, or problem related, or what was called trauma informed care. For the victim, we have moved from trauma informed care to healing centered engagement.
Right.
You may use techniques like EMDR, and which is one technique in a larger system and framework of engagement, where you present the eminent entitlement and possibility to regain a sense of affirmative sexuality. And look at the predicament of a 14-year-old who's been trafficked for sex work, who may have seen 600, 700 men with their pants down, and the way in which helping people approach them, this raid, rescue, repatriation, rehabilitation, reintegration, redressal paradigm. What about reclamation of personhood and reclamation of affirmative sexuality? So these are some of the notions of healing, both for the victim and the perpetrator, that needs to keep in mind, so that a more balanced and an empathic notion develops, even for those who are perpetrators, to really re-examine and that's this is part of the principles of restorative justice.
Right. Right.
There's much more to say, Maitri, but we are pressed
sorry
for
to cut
time.
you off. I'm just going to go to Carol for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to take audience questions.
Sure.
I've got 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think what I would say really in terms of kind of in the UK about how we've developed around rehabilitation, around offenders, I think is a really interesting point for us. When I first started in this probably 25 years ago now, we did rehabilitation because we wanted to reduce the number of victims. And then after many years, we started to realise actually, if we're going to really truly invest in rehabilitation of individuals that have engaged in these kind of behaviours and sexual offences, we have to value them as human beings in order to manage them, support them, and pull them off that kind of offence pathway. So our focus began to shift because it's quite difficult in terms of rehabilitation. We would kind of work with clients and say, well, actually, I'm working with you because I want to reduce the number of victims. That's why I'm here. That didn't really then give them investments in the rehabilitation, because they'd feel actually you don't want to change me as a person, you don't want to understand me better, you actually just doing this because the number of victims. When actually the argument became that by engaging with you and valuing you as a human being and understanding the functions and the motivations around your offending and intervening in terms of that by its very nature then reduces the number of victims. So I think for us, that's just in terms of how we've kind of shifted really in terms of our kind of rehabilitation kind of approaches. And just to kind of finally say a little bit on that around rehabilitation, understanding sexual offending, it is multifactorial, so it's driven by a number of vulnerabilities. And what Marsha and Barbary would say is actually these individuals are not necessarily so dissimilar to ourselves. They present with a range of vulnerabilities that we then try and manage and support. And intervention is not always about a cure, it's about management for that perpetrator as well. There we go. Conscious of time.
Thank you. Thank you. An interesting question, I think, Uma, you might have to answer this, is the feminist movement united in their response to what effective state response should look like? And the person asks about calls for the death sentence, and is there a unified call for or against harsher punishment?
Right. No, I think that this is a sticky question because it is a question of who is a feminist. And if I were to give you my base understanding and my general understanding, not everyone who says I am in the women's movement would be regarded as let's say, I would not regard necessarily every woman who joins the women's movement as someone who has actually internalized what I consider to be the core values of feminism, which is actually to stand for the margins across, not just women. So right. I would look at the women's movement as actually speaking for all margins, right. And has a certain understanding of society, caste, class, state, all of it. So now there is no, thanks. I often say this as a joke, but I think it's important. We don't have a foremother. We are not like the left movement or any other movement. We don't have one godfather who, laid down the law. We have a large number of foremothers, but we don't have one person who's developed theory. The women's movement feminist movement is actually, again, work in progress. It is something that is consciously responding to the challenges of the ground. And in that movement, I don't know of any serious feminist who actually has stood for the death penalty or stood for violence. Right. We do see that the Constitution's grant of the right to life is a fundamental right, and we do not want even the state to take away that from perpetrators, howsoever bad they may be. And right. I think that the second question we have is that when you give the death penalty, it actually raises the bar of evidence so high that you don't actually manage to proceed legally right. against the person, because the courts will immediately knock you down if there is. So there are a number of reasons, practical as well as ethical, which means that the women's movement has taken the stand about, and since the women's movement has stood for nothing but standing against violence, right. All its history. All we've done is to stand against violence. So how can we actually speak of violence as a punitive measure.
Right.
It is not something that we can go along with.
Right.
So that's fundamental, and I want everyone to remember that.
Right. So going on to the next randomly selected question. There's a question about, it's directed to Dr. Seshadri, but let me just check if he's still there. Yes, he is. Yeah. So the question is about, it says, looking at the Indian perspective of huge economic diversity and very particular style of upbringing of children in India, how do you suggest in broader terms that this leads to further hardening of the criminal attitude towards women? And the related question is, how can an early detection of such criminal personalities be deduced by form of test or psychological survey? Actually, the second part of the question I'd like Carol to also answer, but Dr. Seshadri, yeah, please go ahead.
Let me answer the second part first, and I'm sure Carol will have a lot to say. Having worked with children in conflict with the law, there are multiple pathways to vulnerability that they have. Nobody is a born criminal. He's a born criminal. Nobody's a born criminal. In that sense that, and there isn't any, genetics test or genome-wide analysis that you can do even before a child is born on the fetus and say, this guy at the age of 17, that you can say that for a number of genetic diseases like Rett syndrome and Huntington's chorea, about 200 diseases for the genetic causes known, but not for patterns of behavior. We haven't reached that stage of elegance and sophistication in scientific research. And when that precision is not there in something as medically specific as genetic tests, psychological tests are rife with peril if we go that way. So there is no way in which a person, let's say, and there's a reason for this. Why is it that 3 children born in exactly the same adverse circumstances, one of them is affected and 2 of them are not? Or both parents have a mental illness, let's say schizophrenia, but 2 people inherit the gene and the third does not. So the whole nature versus nurture debate. So there's no way in which for, let's say, an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old who has hitherto not demonstrated any signs of any boundary violation or any kind of offense, that you could actually do a test and figure out that. And it's interesting you should ask this question. People often said that before you hire teachers in school, given the kind of abuse that takes place, maybe you should give some tests and figure out whether they have the propensity to abuse children. Now, what kind of a test are you going to give them? Are you going to give them a questionnaire saying, do you have sexual thoughts about children? And have you abused a child ever in your past? And you expect them to say, yes, I do, yes, I do. Particularly if they're savvy and they're motivated. Which is why we believe that the way to go is empowerment of children, because no matter how savvy you may be, a motivated abuser finds ways and means, including throwing a cloth over the CCTV, and
Yeah.
So that's something that we need to keep in mind. I lost track of what the first part of the question was, but I think Carol should go to address this, and perhaps we can come back to the first part of the question.
Well, I think I'll just quickly address that, because I think Dr. Seshadri has kind of explained that beautifully, I have to say. And I think by its very essence, as human beings, we are very complex, and as we should be, actually. And I think it is very difficult to reduce us to a questionnaire or a survey. I think there's not only the social desirability around that, but actually, what are you measuring? And in terms of kind of criminality, people engage in criminal behaviours, people desist from that behaviour as well. I think if there was a survey or a questionnaire, it would make my job as a forensic practitioner a lot easier. But unfortunately, it doesn't. It's not like a medical, kind of even medical kind of difficulties have got their own problems around kind of having very astute kind of surveys, questionnaires, asking general questions, but it's even more complex around kind of criminality. So I can't really add much more to Dr. Seshadri there.
All right. The next question, I think if all three of the panelists could answer that. To what degree can sexual violence or offense be attributed to individuals and not socially learned and internalized behavior?
It's absolutely a combination of both, Maitri. We cannot do a simplistic binary splitting of this. As I said, going back to what David Finkelhor has often said, these are people who have a need. So there is an individual issue here, and they have access in the context of child sexual abuse. They have access to children, and they have no internal controls. And internal controls are part of the socialization, part of your belief systems about men and women, about gender, about entitlement, about inner justifications, and external restraints. Refers to supervision and to vigilance. Take something like grooming, a very pernicious process. See, not all child sexual abuse, and it may ultimately lead to penetrative intercourse, but it was not violent or coercive. So a motivated abuser, how does he or she figure out that the child is vulnerable? Because everybody knows in the neighborhood that the parents fight. They often separate briefly. Everybody knows that the father comes home drunk every night, that the child sits for hours outside the house because the door is locked, and that's how you figure out that the child is vulnerable. And then you approach the child and establish a relationship, treats, money, befriend the child, say nice things like, I like being with you, I like talking to you, I like you so much, I hope you like me. And then you alienate the child from the family, saying that, they don't understand you. I'm the only one who understands you. I'm your friend. And then you sexualize the relationship. And then you ask for secrecy by using either the threat method, or to say, if you tell someone, my life will be ruined, thereby making it very complicated for the child. So we need to keep in mind that there are these kind of complex processes that really take place, behind perpetration, and how, whether it's date rape or stranger, that there is a socialization process which is partly patriarchal, partly gendered, partly from a sense of entitlement, partly the whole business of the culture of impunity. And the culture of impunity is hugely problematic, particularly when no one can touch me. Do you know who my uncle is, or who my grandfather is, and all your political connections and all the economic divide. Yeah.
Uma?
Again, I can't look at only the child. Let's look at, to me, the culture of impunity, to my mind, is central. When you find that actually nobody considers you wrong in doing what you've done, there's a kind of social entitlement based on hierarchy and so on. In the context of marriage, the husband has it. Also, to some extent, uncles and so on, perpetrating violence on children, and the difficulty of, for instance, saying when confronting it, because often mothers will actually not take the issue seriously because there's too much at stake. I mean, the whole family, the dynamics, the economics of the family will be disrupted and so on. So there's a kind of silence that's important. So let's look at impunity that comes on the one hand from power, and the other comes from the fact that there are certain things that you do not talk about. Right. And if you do talk about it, the person who talks about it is wrong. Right. How can the father be doing this? I know one of my very dear students was abused from the time she was a child. Her mother never stood by her. And I think the trauma of that went on all her life, and she took her own life in the end, So it's so impunity actually resides, and there is a social impunity that is given to violence of this kind, and it'll start with the young person is not the only person. Whole levels. You look at the counter narratives that people are now putting out in the context of rape. What is the need for the counter narrative? Because you need to immediately disengage, say no violence was done. It was actually consensual. So this consensual question is an important one. And in India, it becomes even more complicated because love itself cannot be consensual. It is bound by the damn caste and class and whatever it is. That marriages are still being arranged. So at the end of the day, how do we deal with this complex baggage? Because impunity is being granted at so many different levels.
Right.
And the challenge for us is to be able to identify each of them and maybe think of different strategies in which you confront the violence and work on them differently. So I don't think you can have one single model.
Right.
And I don't think that I can take a person who has done violence and then say this is the one treatment that could work. I think that's easier said for the child sexual abuse person, but that is, to me, when you infantilize women anyway, they're all children at the end of the day. What are you doing? So I would say it's a really tough challenge.
Right. Karen?
Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'm aware we're kind of pushing on time. I'm going to try and be brief. I've kind of forgotten a little bit around the actual question. By the time we kind of talked about all various things.
So the question was, how much do we place responsibility on an individual, and how much responsibility, or is it's a process of socialization?
I think it's a combination. I think it is complex. I think the individual is responsible for their behaviour. But if you have an individual who has a lot of developmental experiences that are putting them on a pathway of vulnerability, there are lots of things in society, certainly within the UK society, that could actually give them support for their views. So actually that is the way we should behave, or that's seen as being acceptable. So if you have those belief structures, you will find something within society to support that belief structure. And our job really, certainly as clinicians, is to break that down for that individual, and to get them to kind of really critically evaluate what is going on around them in society as well. But I think in summary, kind of sexual offending is complex, is multifactorial. And I think really our focus is very much around looking at the motivation and the functions around that behaviour as a pathway toward intervention.
Right. So we are 2 minutes over time, and I'd just like to pick up on something that Uma had said, that restorative practices for the offender or the accused cannot be put at the mantle of the women's movement and saying you also take care of that. And I think that's an interesting point, because I wonder if when we're talking about the perpetrator, in a way, and this may be very controversial, but who will talk about the perpetrator? So we know that we have psychiatrists and psychologists talking about perpetrators of child sexual violence, and but I don't know if currently we have enough people saying, let's think about the perpetrator in a non retributive penal manner. And this is not to say that the women's movement should take it, of course not, but I guess there's a need for a massive alliance that is emerging to have practices and policies which are restorative, starting with the survivor perhaps, and saying what are the effective policies that are needed from the state to heal the survivor. Punishing, I suppose, is not necessarily the only answer, but also what's going to heal the offender, and what policies can make the offender accountable without, as Uma said, without being very violent, because violence clearly is not the answer either on this side of the equation or that side of the equation. So, okay, if if any of you have any final comments to
I
make.
just want one quick one, which is acknowledgement itself is extremely important. And the opposite of impunity is acknowledgement. Now,
Right.
if you do not acknowledge it, neither will the survivor
Yeah,
heal, nor will the perpetrator heal.
absolutely.
Because if that perpetrator is not made accountable for his wrong, how can he heal? How can we actually proceed with actually healing him? Because he's
Right.
not even acknowledging it. So
Right.
I think the challenge is first accountability and acknowledgement, and then
Yeah.
we might be able to move in the
Move
direction
forward.
of
Yeah.
healing both.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we are 5 minutes past the time, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the panelists for an absolutely smashing discussion. And I'm sorry to the audience if I wasn't able to take all of the questions, but I think Dr. Seshadri did answer some of them in the chat box. So thank you everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.